the increasingly sort of Kafkaesque nature of and I don't use that word lightly. What I mean by that is I'm not in any way trivializing the death, the bloodshed, the continuing carnage in Gaza, but the relationship between reality and reportage, I don't think has ever been more strained, and it reaches into almost every corner of the conversation, doesn't it? Because the American government, essentially warned Netanyahu of consequences in the event of a major offensive being undertaken against the city of Rafah. And there is now an offensive being undertaken against the city of Rafah, which the Israelis will simply claim was not a major offensive, and Joe Biden will be left to dance on a pinhead and either conclude with quite a lot of evidence that it is, and therefore enact the consequences that he has been threatening, or he will accept this this profoundly disingenuous invitation from Benjamin Netanyahu to pretend that it's not a major offensive, even as tanks this morning were moving into Jabalia in the northern Gaza Strip, tanks and troops crossing a key highway on the outskirts of Rafah in the south, tanks trying to advance towards the heart of that camp, which is the biggest of Gaza's 8 historic refugee camps. Some of these people have already moved 3-4 times. Residents have said, this is Reuters reporting, that tank shells were landing at the centre of the camp. Airstrikes had destroyed clusters of houses. Hundreds of thousands of people told to move without having any clear idea of where they are supposed to move to. Egypt, interestingly, is elected over the weekend to join South Africa in the prosecution of those war crime allegations at the International Criminal Court. That won't obviously affect the court, but it changes the metrics of the entire process. And attention begins to turn. Oh, and meanwhile, thousands of Israelis took to the streets over the weekend calling for a deal to bring home hostages still held in Gaza by Hamas, and also for early elections and the immediate resignation of Benjamin Netanyahu. Opinion polls, interestingly enough, show that the public opinion simply doesn't wear the idea that the so-called eradication of Hamas is going to be possible, and yet that remains what Benjamin Netanyahu is committed to. In many ways, it's all he's got left. I don't think anybody really sets much store by the idea that he's committed to the rescuing or the return of the hostages. We know that he said, despite some very senior spokespeople apparently not having heard him say this, that even if hostages were returned, he would still go into Rafah. We're now dancing on that pinhead of what constitutes a major offensive and what doesn't. It's absolutely crazy. But attention now moves to this question. I mean, in a way, what do you think he thinks the end is going to look like is the question that I'm edging you towards. But that is quite nebulous, isn't it? So I need to work a little bit harder to zone in on what this actual inquiry is. But the Americans are now warning that extremists will return to fill any power vacuum left in Gaza. In fact, they've warned specifically that any power vacuum in Gaza would be filled by Hamas again, amid a resurgence of fighting between the terror group and the IDF. Places that they had claimed they had, from which they had eradicated Hamas, they are now going back to revivify conflict. So that first suspicion we had on this program ages and ages ago, that this was an unachievable goal, I think gathers weight every day. The other word I saw was anarchy, that there will be anarchy. So you're going to have either extremism or anarchy moving into the vacuum created by these continuing attacks. And the Times of Israel reporting that the leader of Hamas isn't even in Rafah anymore, having fled to the tunnels around Khan Yunis before the IDF closed in. So again, the likelihood of so-called eradication moves ever further out of reach. And of course, the fate of the 132 remaining hostages looks, I would say, more and more precarious. But if Netanyahu, I mean, this is the bit. This is where we're going to confine our conversation, or rather, it's where we're going to direct our conversation. Now, is not for you or for me, but for Benjamin Netanyahu. What does the end look like? Now, there are people in Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet who want to colonise Gaza. I hope that doesn't come as a shock to anybody. It's not an opinion, it's simply counting. There are people in Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet who are committed to what they call Greater Israel, which would also pose fairly hefty problems for the Kingdom of Jordan, never mind the international community. But Netanyahu has never been a subscriber to that school of thought. He's publicly and passionately opposed to a two-state solution. That sometimes gets lost in the rhetoric and conversation. And of course, there were as long ago as January, there were talks of sort of relocating Palestinians to elsewhere in the world. So we can't rule out that sort of thinking. But I don't personally believe it's Netanyahu's thinking. I think we've learnt in recent months that he's sufficiently opportunistic to contemplate almost anything if he thinks it'll keep him in power and out of court in the short term. But it's not a position he has held previously. Okay, he can't believe that eradicating Hamas and securing the release of the hostages are simultaneously possible. You can do one or you can do the other. I don't think you can do one, at least, but you can't do both. Some very senior Israeli, I think there was a former prime minister making that point publicly last week. You can't do both, not least because the likelihood of some of the remaining hostages being in the firing line of the ordnance currently dropping on a refugee camp in Rafah is high. You know, what possible discrimination do the IDF display when bombing Gaza that would suggest they're trying to keep hostages alive? Do you see what I mean? We don't know how many have died, but somewhat unhelpfully for people trying to maintain objectivity throughout these conversations, there will be hostages who have been killed by Israeli ordnance, not just the three who were shot dead by the IDF while waving white flags, or no, they'd taken off their shirts to prove that they were safe. They were hostages who'd managed somehow to evade their captors, and they got shot dead by Israeli soldiers. Again, something that is known, but perhaps not as widely reported as it should be. But the conversation, for good or for ill, has moved to the next phase, even if the military engagement hasn't. The protests on the street of Israel are about getting rid of Netanyahu and getting the hostages back. There seems to be an acceptance there that the eradication of Hamas is unachievable. But alongside that sits the news from America that there will be a power vacuum and it will be filled by Hamas, or the next iteration of whatever anti-Israel extremism looks like. So what does Netanyahu expect to happen? And I haven't got an answer to that question. And part of the reason why I haven't got an answer to that question is because I haven't been interested in the end game. I've been too heartbroken by the reality and continue to be. I don't know if you saw Gary Lineker's comments at the weekend about crying. And I had another penny drop moment. The blooming heck. We live in a country where empathy is discouraged. The ruling class in this country has empathy, emotional literacy beaten out of it. Literally, when I was at school, creating people that could march to the other side of the world under the auspices of empire, and not just start bossing around the people who'd lived there forever, but also start nicking all their natural resources and sending them back to Britain. You have to create a very peculiar sort of person to undertake that sort of project. And that person can't really be unduly burdened by empathy or sympathy or emotional literacy. And it filters down. Our whole society in many ways is defined by the necessity of having men in our ruling class who can go all around the world and boss everybody else around. And so that means when people show emotion, when people show empathy, they get attacked by people who aren't capable of it or who are frightened of it. And the idea that it's controversial to talk about crying at the sight of dead children is one of the ugliest marks of how mad this whole saga has been and has become. Because the only thing you can say with certainty is that the death toll will grow. The 1,200 who died on October the 7th when Hamas invaded Israel or mounted an incursion into Israel, 250 taken hostage, of whom about half remain, some released, some known to be dead. And then the as yet unconfirmed figures, much higher figures of Palestinian dead, well over 30,000, it would appear, and probably much higher once the dust has settled. So I think today's the day, for the first time, that we're going to ask, what's it going to look like afterward? What's it going to look like when it's over? And you can come at that from whatever angle you want, can't you? Because I don't know. All I know is that as a consumer of news, I am now hearing warnings of anarchy, power vacuums, and extremism. We've thought from the start that the Israeli tactics, that Netanyahu's tactics will create generations, possibly even more dedicated to the destruction of Israel than previous ones. How do you process the deaths of your entire family, the dislocations, the dispossessions, without holding Israel responsible? So that's part of the question that I'm asking. But if you look at the question of how Benjamin Netanyahu thinks this is going to end, and you can't answer that question, you should be quite frightened, I think, don't you? So there are two ways into this. Number one, 0345 6060 973. Jamie says, you've dropped so many pennies today, James, you must have £1 by now. It's not far off, Jamie. But question number one is, how do you think this is going to end? Especially if you know this part of the world better than I do. What's it going to look like? How does this end? First time in my life I just understood why George Orwell writes about perpetual war in 1984. Never fully got that before that moment right there. But I think it has to end in terms of the current engagement. So how does it end? What does it look like? What does Gaza look like when this is over? What does Israel look like when this is over? 0345 6060 973.